The Secret Language Couple by J.P. O'Brien. Things on Sycamore Street were, at present, rather transitory. It was not just the air that had turned crisp, or the leaves that now crunched underfoot. Imelda Ellsworth had been acting differently all summer. The reason, known only to herself and local grief counsellor Dr. Shetty, was that she had secretly been attending therapy. After a handful of rocky getting-to-know-you sessions, leading to Dr. Shetty privately thinking of Imelda as the Hoover Dam of clients, Imelda inadvertently touched on a name, David, that finally allowed her emotions to burst forth like water through a widening crack. Dr. Shetty was soon able to ascertain that David had been Imelda's husband. They had evidently enjoyed 5 years of blissful marriage before he tragically succumbed to a vicious bout of cancer that took his life at age 31, just a few days shy of Imelda's own 30th birthday. This came as something of a revelation, not necessarily to Dr. Shetty, whose work often required her to uncover just such instances of repressed personal trauma, but to Imelda herself. The connection between the tragic loss and the decade and a half she had since spent fastidiously cleaning and organising was now so obvious that learning about it felt less like a light bulb going off and more like a full-on fireworks display. On the plus side, their next few sessions saw a dramatic upswing in progress. Talking about David out loud for the first time, something that not a soul on Sycamore Street knew about, not even Marigold Weatherby, allowed Imelda to breathe easily at last. She began making the conscious decision not to try and fix every little detail in her life. She let her hair grow a little frizzy and even allowed a tiny bit of dust to accumulate on her skirting boards. These were gentle reminders that, as unpalatable as it sounded, some things were simply out of her control, and that was okay. But if there was one thing that would surely make everyone else sit up and take notice of Imelda Ellsworth, it was that not every hair on her head was perfectly in place. Luckily, so far, she had managed to avoid any confrontational questions by moving as invisibly as possible. Unfortunately, it was precisely when returning from a particularly cathartic discussion with Dr. Shetty that Imelda noticed her next-door neighbour Ben Radcliffe backing out of his house. He had become so engrossed in his collaboration with Joe Caldwell that he had unknowingly allowed his cupboards to grow bare and was now setting off in search of some much-needed nutrition. Seeing as it was too late to run away, Imelda quickly rubbed her tear-streaked mascara face down her sleeve and bolted towards her own house. "Oh, hello," Ben said when he heard her. "Is everything all—" "Fine, thanks," blurted out Imelda, slamming the door closed behind her. She exhaled and leant against it for a moment. Then, following Dr. Shetty's recommendation to let the past breathe, she immediately went to retrieve a photo of David she had previously put away, apologised to it, and placed it back on its shelf. Ben continued to lock his door, daydreaming that Imelda must have been replaced, but by which nefarious culprit he couldn't possibly say. An invasion of the body snatchers situation, perhaps? He shook his head and carried on up the path, but the train of thought was suddenly interrupted by the sound of unfamiliar voices approaching. Ben watched 2 backpackers stroll past on the other side of the fence. They were carrying large, travelling rucksacks strapped up with sleeping bags and had well-worn hiking shoes over tanned, muscular legs. Suspended from the front of the woman was a carry case with a plastic domed window and a cat sleeping peacefully inside. "Hello," the male backpacker said with a cheerful wave, before resuming the chat with his partner. Ben waved uncertainly and watched them go by. As he let himself out of the gate, he continued to discreetly observe the couple walking over to the old Hannibal house. Bizarrely, he found it impossible to distinguish any actual words they were saying to one another. They turned up the garden path and inspected the black rot of the porch for a moment, then let themselves through the front door. He was so confused by everything that had just transpired, he didn't notice Marigold Weatherby sidling up behind him on her way back from the bakery. "Ben, my love," she sang, causing Ben to nearly jump out of his skin. "Oh, didn't mean to startle you. You look like you've seen a ghost, dear." Ben chuckled uncomfortably to himself. "Sorry, I was in my own world. Although it was a little odd. I've just seen some strangers walk by and go into the old Hannibal house, big backpacks with them. I was actually trying to work out what language they were speaking. Not something I think I've ever heard before. Failing to conceal her delight at this delicious tidbit of neighbourly gossip, Marigold raised an eyebrow. Really? But, noticing the pastry treat in her hand and hearing his gut growl impatiently, Ben excused himself and recommenced his quest for a sandwich. Just a few doors away, the Burns family were gathering around the table for their own Sunday lunch, although something was decidedly off. Having discovered 2 scabs underneath the fair hair on his scalp, young Charlie was now convinced he was growing devil's horns and was refusing to open his mouth for fear of finding fangs growing too. The good news was that his father Dom's voice had at last recovered after his unfortunate accident. He was back to grumbling and groaning about the state of the world as usual. But his moody silence had somehow now shifted across the table to Jake. Though Jake had briefly found validation for his drumming with a real-life band, it was now not clear whether Discount Sushi even still existed, their other drummer, Peter Lapp, having stormed out when discovering that he was being replaced. Jake was hardly at fault for the incident, but guilt nonetheless jabbed sharply in his stomach. Almost overnight, he had lost all enthusiasm for playing, abandoning his weeks-long habit of staying behind after school to practice, and instead trudging straight home where at least the pain could be kept somewhat at bay by crisps and video games. Meanwhile, his stepmother Sandy was finding it quite difficult to keep track of who in the family was talking and who wasn't. She turned to her teenage stepson as he pulled back the plastic lid from a tray of cheese slices. "What about you, Jake? How's your drumming going lately?" Where this would have once been a perfectly innocuous conversation topic, the sour-faced frown she got back from Jake revealed this was no longer the case. She forced a sympathetic smile. Are you still playing?" Jake shrugged. "Don't feel like it." "Why not?" "Well," Jake helped himself to some ham from the centre of the table. "I got invited to play with this band, but it turns out they already have a drummer." "That doesn't sound too bad. Why can't you both play?" Jake rolled his eyes. "Bands can't have 2 drummers." "So much for that," Dom interrupted gleefully. Then, upon receiving a glare from his wife, "What?" Jake ignored him. "I feel really bad about it. I didn't know there would be all this drama." "It sounds complicated," said Sandy. "But don't worry, give it a bit of time. These things usually sort themselves out. Don't give up just yet." Now it was Sandy's turn to be glared at. "I guess. Thanks." Sandy returned to her plate, quietly proud of her teenage stepson for managing to display more emotional maturity than his adult father. Over the next several days, the identity of the mysterious backpacking arrivals in town was to be confirmed by Marigold Weatherby and her seemingly limitless network of information. Apparently a distant nephew of Bertrand Hannibal, 35-year-old Spencer Cottle and his Eastern European wife Anna had met while travelling through Kashmir at the foot of the Himalayas. Each armed with generational wealth and a coincidental longing to replicate the Grand Tour, a rite of passage for aristocratic youth in the 16th century, the pair of them had gone on to visit approximately 2/3 of the known countries on Earth together, as well as 2 that are only accessible to those with the financial good fortune to have heard of them. Spencer and Anna had altered their route and boarded a container ship at Algeciras, coming to town to investigate the abandoned property they had unexpectedly inherited. But their conduct didn't exactly instill confidence. Much of the neighbourhood, already cautious of anything to do with the supposedly haunted house that sat on the corner of Arbour Park, found it strange the Cottles appeared perfectly content in their sleeping bags on the floor and cooking cans of beans with their camping stove despite possessing unheard-of sums of money. As if that weren't enough, the couple had a decidedly odd manner of speaking to one another whenever they were within earshot of their neighbours, a strange language that none of them could identify. Their cat, Mrs. Chippy, was making no friends either. While Spencer and Anna explored the large property, the striped tabby delighted in prowling along the tops of neighbourhood fences and taking particular interest in Maria Callas, much to Marigold's distress. The elderly lady started holding a protective hand in front of her canary whenever she walked past the derelict property, whether the cat was in sight or not. Before long, several of the most unsettled neighbours, Marigold and Clive Rotwood among them, marched over to fiery, pragmatic estate agent Lorraine Hershey's house in search of legal recourse for getting the new couple out of town. They were surprised to see Lorraine tidying up her front garden with an altogether different appearance, less buttoned down, less combative, and worse, almost totally disinterested in the property. "I'm sorry," Lorraine said, lifting up a tricycle and dusting dirt off its seat. "It's not mine to sell. The house already belongs to them." There was a hint of something in her voice, despondency perhaps, but one could almost have mistaken it for relief. Unknown to her neighbours, something had changed in Lorraine of late. Once she had seen the old Hannibal House project involuntarily taken from her, been forced to make peace with being outperformed professionally, and then been told second-hand of a potentially deadly incident involving her daughters, she had reassessed her priorities. She had even asked Mr. Munro for a reduction in work hours at Guildwood and Hart. Stepping back from work was something she had never once considered in her previous 8 years of parenthood. Her twins Daisy and Ruby, unfamiliar with this new, attentive parenting style, were initially uneasy about it, tiptoeing around their mother like she was a coiled spring ready to go off at any moment. But when it turned out that all she wanted to do was spend time with them, get to know them, and even read to them, they eventually started to relax. It turned out to be rather nice having a mother for once. The unofficial anti-coddle movement's plan having failed before it had even begun, the group left the Hershey house disheartened. Things were going no more smoothly at school in the wake of the discount sushi fallout. For the previous couple of weeks, former best friends Peter Lapp and Rory Caldwell had been playing a curious game of cat and mouse. While Rory was most eager to apologise, but just as much paralysed by embarrassment and guilt, Peter had opted to extract himself from the situation altogether, hiding from the others in the computer lab during lunch break. The lab, not coincidentally, sat at the exact far end of the school from the music block. It was actually Jake who noticed Peter's unmistakable long red hair through the computer lab window one afternoon. He immediately went to find Rory to tell him of Peter's whereabouts. Rory quietly peeked in the door, unsure how he wanted the conversation between them to go, but certain that the longer he left it, the more permanent the damage to their friendship would be. "Hey," he said quietly, taking the computer next to Peter. Peter didn't reply. He focused on his screen and went on clicking his mouse. "I'm really sorry," tried Rory again. "We didn't mean to hurt your feelings. I wish we could still be friends." "Friends, sure," responded Peter, his voice dripping with bitterness. "We've been friends for our whole lives. Doesn't mean it means anything." "It does." Peter raised his hand to Rory's contestation. "You know what actual friendship is? It's not stabbing each other in the back. It's wanting to hang out together even if one of them might not be on the same level. I can't believe I have to explain that to you." "What do you mean, the same level?" "The band!" Peter exploded, rolling his eyes. His raised voice caused one or two other students to turn from their computers to look at them. "You guys all got to pick your favourite instruments and were cruising along on them right away. Meanwhile, I get stuck behind the drums even though I never wanted to. But you know what I did? I stuck with it anyway because my friends wanted me to and I didn't want to let them down. Then you guys just go ahead and ditch me all the same." Rory's face burned bright red. He began picking at a loose corner of the mouse mat in front of him. "You never liked playing with us?" "Well, I did, even though it was clear to all of us pretty fast that I wasn't going to be the musician you hoped for. But I thought we were just doing it because it was fun." The two sat in a painful silence for a moment, the clicking and typing around them intolerably loud. At least the other students had now lost interest in their argument and returned to their work. Peter went on. "Look, I admit that other kid is a better drummer than me. Frankly, that's not hard. I've never been super coordinated, and I knew from the start it wasn't going to work. You guys were all just so enthusiastic about the band, so I gave it my best shot anyway. Does that clear up the meaning of friendship for you?" "Why didn't you tell us you didn't like what you were doing?" To Rory's surprise, Peter laughed. "Because I got to hang out with my friends. I liked that part. Who wouldn't? But all you've done is show that isn't half as important as sounding good. Why would anyone trust you after this?" Rory slumped in his chair. "Well, I'm telling you, we want you back. Screw the band. Peter shook his head. No, don't screw the band. That's not what I want. It's obvious how important it is to all of you, but especially you. This might come as a surprise, but I actually don't want you to stop because of me. And honestly, I heard you guys playing with the new kid. It sounds... He laughed again. Anyway. So how do we get past this? You can't just hide from us forever. Well, I've thought about it, and I do want to be friends again. I appreciate your apology. But the last thing in the world I want is to play drums for you now. Forget the stupid drums. Rory slammed his hand on the table. Some heads turned back to them again. You can be our backup dancer for all I care. Play the triangle. Stand in front and sing if you want. Really? Rory knew he had only made the suggestion in jest, but no sooner had it slipped out of his mouth than he noticed Peter staring into space at the thought. He had to nudge him playfully with his elbow to bring him back to reality. Sure, if it means you'll come and hang out again. To be fair, prancing around at the front of the stage probably doesn't have nearly as many things to concentrate on as the drums. The faraway look lingered in Peter's eyes. That could be fun. Rory's brow softened in relief. Honestly, he said, the fun part is the only thing that matters to me, I promise. After years of Lorraine Hershey having been considered a contentious busybody in the neighbourhood, more focused on her work than on her daughters, more focused on overreaction than being supportive, the change in her disposition was stark. Tom and Catherine Evans each did a cartoonish double-take, seeing the new-look Herscheys sitting together on their front porch like the front cover of a magazine, Lorraine filling their 2 glasses from an icy pitcher of fruit juice. Violet Castellanos, on the other hand, still relatively new to the neighbourhood, took it in her stride. Lorraine flagged her down when she walked past with Dapper, something clearly on her mind. Lorraine, how have you been? Well, I needed to thank you for lending us The Little Prince. Leona too, of course. It took me a moment to get round to it, but the girls and I have been reading it every evening since. Both of them absolutely adore it. Well, I'm glad. Leona will be delighted. There was something else, too. She looked over her shoulder at the girls sitting in the shade. Mind if we go for a walk? Only when they were an inaudible distance from the house did Lorraine clear her throat. It's something Marigold said to me. You know how she brought the girls back round after she found them, you know. Lorraine gestured towards the crown of her head with a clawed hand meant to represent flames. Violet still shuddered at the thought of Ruby's hair ablaze, even if Ruby herself seemed to have already gotten over it. The 8-year-old was now sporting a short haircut, having asked the similarly short-haired Helena to cut it just like hers. Of course. Well, it was before she went to get them. She told me she had lost a child of her own, a son. That's terrible. Poor Marigold. I had no idea, Violet said, her hand covering her mouth. Me neither, but it flipped a switch in me. I realised I've been going about everything all wrong. What do you mean? With the girls. Marigold was right. Lorraine hung her head. I've been a bad mother. Violet threw her arms around her new friend, more fearful than anything that she may see this otherwise unbreakable woman break down in tears. Of course you haven't. I see it now. I need to make amends for years of lost time. Starting to read together is only the beginning. I see what an extraordinary young woman Leona has turned out to be, and you are obviously the reason. I wonder if you could tell me how you've done it? In the end, it was Violet who couldn't hold back tears. They arrived at the front step of her house with Violet sniffling into a tissue she had found in her pocket. When she let them both in, she jumped at the sight of the aforementioned extraordinary young woman reading a magazine in the living room, her legs dangling over the side of the armchair. The teenager gave them a polite hello, but thankfully never took her eyes from her reading. Good news! Violet burst out brightly to disguise her tears. The girls loved The Little Prince. Leona smiled out of the side of her mouth. It's impossible not to. Love, Lorraine corrected. We're still only halfway. But it's true, they do, and I wanted to thank you for letting us borrow it. As Leona told Mrs. H she was welcome, Violet placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Lorraine and I needed to have a little talk. You don't mind going over to keep an eye on the girls? Maybe you could ask them about their favourite parts." "Cool," Leona said, tossing aside the magazine. She was about to get up when Violet threw her arms around Leona to squeeze her tightly from the side. "Mum, have you been crying?" Leona's brief conversation with the Hershey twins on the front porch that afternoon would turn out to have quite an impact. The very next day, Ruby surprised both herself and her twin sister by saying she'd forgotten something at school and needed to head back, and that she would see Daisy at home later. Daisy raised an eyebrow and watched her hurry away. This would mark the very first time in their lives the twins had not been at each other's sides. Before long, they would even call an end to their long-standing game of dare with a respectable draw. As for where Ruby had gone that afternoon, it was to make an uncharacteristic appearance in Miss Tiny's library. She creaked open the door and timidly approached the librarian, wondering what else there might be to read. Miss Tiny was so excited to show her around, she could barely keep the beaming smile off her face. Daisy, on the other hand, would go on to find company in the school's rugby team. Coach Solander had been sceptical of an 8-year-old girl showing up to an after-school session, but more impressed by her sheer moxie than anything else, he taught her the drill they were working on and told her to get in line. When it was her turn, he practically had to pull her off the tackle bag. He ended that practice smiling almost as much as Miss Tiny had been, later commenting that he had never seen someone so young with so much determination to win in her veins. One evening, Lorraine came into the girls' room to find Daisy there alone and asked where her sister was. To Lorraine's puzzlement, Daisy simply responded, "I haven't seen her." It didn't take long before public opinion on the Cottles softened considerably, initiated remarkably enough by the grumpy Clive Rotwood. It had been after watching Spencer inadvertently sweep some grass cuttings onto the public footpath that Rotwood had stormed over to give the menacing youngster a piece of his mind, only to find himself immersed in conversation. Rotwood was quickly converted upon learning of the young man's stellar private education. It turned out that the bizarre language Spencer had been overheard speaking with his wife actually contained several elements of Latin. Spencer explained to Rotwood, a former Latin teacher himself, that he and Anna had initially bonded over their mastery of a dozen or so languages between them, and had therefore challenged themselves to devise and communicate in a new secret tongue all of their own. This form of speech incorporated grammatical rules and vocabulary from sources as disparate as Russian, Japanese, and Sanskrit, and was designed to be as impenetrable as possible to outside ears, so that they might gossip undetected in shared hostel rooms or crowded train carriages. Rotwood carried out the remainder of the chat in spoken Latin himself, making sure to pepper in as many obscure expressions as he could. He was not sure whether to be impressed or annoyed that his new polyglot counterpart was more than capable of keeping up. "Impressive," he gushed. "Why can't all young language learners be as dedicated as yourself?" Anna, meanwhile, was finding common ground of her own with Marigold Weatherby. It transpired that her great-aunt Rutilda had similarly been an operatic performer in the 1950s, and had once even shared a stage with Marigold herself in Vienna. Marigold took great pleasure reminiscing about that period of her life, asking fondly after Anna's great-aunt and extended family as if they were her own flesh and blood, and feeling suitably ashamed of herself for having previously jumped to such judgmental conclusions. "It's obvious how much they adore each other," beamed Marigold to Maria Callas after Anna had left, professing that their love must be so strong they hadn't had the words to express it even with all their combined languages. Unfortunately, no sooner had the neighbourhood started to warm up to the harmless Cottles that several of the other couples in town began to grow privately concerned about the supposed inadequacies in their own relationships. Tom and Catherine, who had recently brought baby James into the world and who had by all accounts never been closer, found themselves bickering over the most trivial things like hairs in the sink or who had left the windows open. Adrian, despite having started culinary school with the sole purpose of tending to his fiancée's dietary requirements, now also found himself driving to pick her up from the animal hospital every day just to prove his commitment. And though it was far from Lars's nature to be jealous, he was now working overtime at his carpentry workbench, carving yet more gifts for Miss Tiny. Even Mr. Burgess was reaching out to hold his wife's hand more. The odd tension in the air every time they came near did not go unnoticed by the Cottles themselves, and showing an innate understanding of the mechanism of Sycamore Street already, the pair went to Marigold in search of advice.
"Oh, pay them no mind," said the octogenarian. "Love isn't a competition, and they'll all come around sooner or later."
Spencer and Anna simply exchanged a confused look. "What are we competing for?" asked Spencer.
"They think they're competing with you, dear. You can hardly blame them, you two coming along with this secret lover's language and all."
Once again, Spencer and Anna exchanged a glance before breaking into incredulous laughter.
"If they only knew what we talk about,"
Anna burst out, with a dismissive wave of the hand.
"Honestly, most of the time it's truly mundane things," Spencer continued. "Discussing what's for dinner, or reminding the other to pick up milk."
Marigold was quick to join in with the laughter.
"You don't have to tell me, dear. After all, love in its purest moments really is that mundane."
As their host topped up their tea, the younger couple agreed, while Mrs. Chippy, whose hunting of Maria Callas had thankfully evolved into a bored coexistence, dozed on the back of the sofa with her tail waving lazily.
"I wonder if you'd help everyone else see that," suggested Spencer.
With a wink, Marigold said she'd see what she could do. With more than a dash of apprehension from Rory, Alex, Enrico, even Peter himself, the four founding members of Discount Sushi, along with Jake, were once again together on the school stage. Everyone exchanged nonchalant teenage nods as guitar cases were unclipped and drumsticks were retrieved from backpacks. Jake lost his grip of one of the sticks and it clattered to the floor, seeming to reverberate through the large hall at a deafening volume. All the while, Peter stood awkwardly alongside the mic stand and hid behind his hair. Rory cleared his throat uncomfortably.
"All right,"
he began, but just as abruptly stopped.
"I mean, how shall we do this? I haven't ever imagined these songs with lyrics or anything."
Peter shrugged.
"Am I just supposed to make words up on the spot?"
Enrico and Alex exchanged a sceptical glance, then looked back at Rory.
"No, I guess not. Did you maybe ever find yourself humming along in your head when we played them before?" "Are you serious? I could barely concentrate on what I was supposed to be playing."
Rory scratched the side of his neck and grimaced.
"Shall we just see what happens?"
suggested Alex, turning up the volume knob on his bass.
"Maybe we'll have one of those epiphany moments. Yeah, like a rock and roll origin story," added Enrico.
Rory repositioned his guitar.
"All right, shall we start with Rasputin's Funk? And then I guess just jump in whenever, Pete. Give it your best Ian Curtis."
He turned to Jake, sat behind the drums.
"Ready?"
The young drummer clutched his sticks and nodded. Rory launched into one of his more driving, up-tempo riffs, which Alex and Enrico then dutifully joined. Jake added a rumbling tom groove that eventually crashed into a four-to-the-floor beat. Once the instrumental section was in full swing, Rory looked up from his fretboard and glanced towards Peter. He was standing totally motionless, holding such a tight grip on the microphone that his knuckles were already turning white. He was yet to let out a single sound. After a short while of urging him on with widened eyes, Rory slipped over a note and his riff fell apart. The others also stopped playing. With a definite sense of awkwardness hovering in the air, an epiphany moment it was not.
"I'm sorry,"
wailed the nervous frontman.
"I have no idea what to sing." "Wait," piped up Jake. "Haven't you got any, textbooks or anything?"
Rory immediately caught on.
"Hey, yeah, check your bag."
Peter shuffled to the front of the stage where he had left his backpack. He pulled out a battered copy of Moby Dick from English class and held it up.
"This? Perfect. We'll go again and just use some random page as your lyrics sheet."
Peter couldn't be sure if he was joking.
"That'll sound ridiculous. It won't even rhyme. It doesn't matter what you're singing, it's just so you don't have to think about it."
And so they went again. As the opening bars built, Peter started to gently sway, eyes fixed on the page folded back in his hand. Then, with a flick of his voluptuous red hair, he let out an explosive scream that immediately turned all eyes to him. Within seconds, he was crooning line after line about the methods of extracting blubber, and doing so with a tunefulness and charisma the others wouldn't have ever previously thought possible. All Rory could do was play as hard as he could to keep up, but when he looked over to the drum kit and caught eyes with Jake, he smiled and nodded excitedly. Rory was not the only Caldwell experiencing a musical second wind. His father Joe, already thoroughly invigorated by the process of converting Ben's science fiction into songs, had also now been in contact with the members of his former band, the Mountaintop Synthesis. One phone call after another, Joe enthusiastically proposed a reunion show at the Limelight, the 200-capacity venue in town where the inexperienced foursome had routinely performed in the early 90s before going on to find more widespread fame. The idea had unanimous support from MS's other original members, not to mention from the band's old management. They loved the idea even more. It would be a beautifully nostalgic and highly marketable way to set up a headline tour for the concept album that was apparently just around the corner. With all the moving parts in place, Joe sat his son down at the table, on the verge of exploding with excitement.
"Dad, you're being weird," pointed out Rory.
"Just a bit of good news from your old man," Joe explained, rubbing his palms.
"Are you ready? The Mountaintop Synthesis is getting back together."
But the dismay on Rory's face was hardly the elation that his father had been anticipating. Instead, the boy looked positively crestfallen.
"Why do you have to do this now?"
Rory complained. Joe merely blinked.
"What? You haven't cared about music for years, and now right as soon as I'm starting to do it, you all of a sudden decide to come back to it?" "No, that's not. Just because you've got nothing else going on in your life. You already had your shot and you threw it away. That's not my fault."
The accusation stung Joe, but he was so startled by Rory's uncharacteristic outburst that when he opened his mouth to deny it, nothing more than a barely audible squeak fell out. In truth, he had never lost his passion for music. Not once during this 18-year hiatus. His life had simply given him another priority, which was at this moment shoving past to stomp up to his room.
"Wait, listen,"
Joe managed to call out, but his words were halted by the distant slamming of Rory's door. Joe sat alone in the kitchen for a moment. After collecting his thoughts, he crept up the stairs to Rory's room, his knuckle hovering above his son's closed door. He had only actually managed to share half of the news. The second part, that he wanted discount sushi to be the opening act at the reunion show, stalled on his tongue. He swallowed it again and retreated downstairs. The two wouldn't speak another word to each other for the rest of the evening. By now, Ruby Hershey was almost as much of a fixture at the library as Lars Gunderson, and in no time at all had rattled her way through a good 3/4 of Miss Tiny's recommendations. It was while coming home one evening that she saw something moving in the bushes just ahead of her in the fading light. She stopped to look more closely.
"Cut it out, Daisy,"
she called out, doing her best to mask the fear in her voice with annoyance. But in the back of her mind, she knew it wasn't actually her sister. As her eyes tried to make sense of the shadows, she saw an orange swirl rustling through the gaps in the leaves. A fox then cautiously emerged and stared right at her.
"Hello,"
Ruby offered gently as the fox flicked its tail. An instant later, the girl found herself staring down nothing but an empty pavement, as some leaves on the branch above it settled into stillness. After a moment of odd serenity, the 8-year-old continued along to her home, unsure what to tell her sister, or if she would even tell her at all. You have been listening to the By Torchlight podcast. For more, visit patreon.com/bytorchlight or search By Torchlight on Spotify and YouTube.